Today is the conclusion, and I would say not long awaited because this is lesson 10, right? So, and Esther, considering Old Testament books, I mean, Esther certainly isn't or wasn't like the book of Job, which was quite painful. I mean, Job really went on, and I mean, relatively speaking, and so what we'll do is we'll go through we'll finish the Hebrew text. There's also additional stuff from the Greek text, which we'll want to look at. And there's even a Colophon, which is really an addendum saying kind of where did the text come from, et cetera, et cetera. So a short little blurb on its lineage. And then we'll put everything together, or at least try to in a good way, to see if it makes sense. Okay? So as we're wending our way through Esther, we find out a few things, of course, that the king, if you make a good argument, he's not that hard to sway, right? But he wants to do in his mind what's best for the Persian Empire. We're able to get that. So Haman, his previous right-hand man, vizier, second from the top guy, actually was quite self-serving. He had he had a lot of baggage, one of which is he hated Jewish people. So when Mordecai disrespected him, I'll show you. And so he writes an edict and convinces Xerxes to say this is good for the empire, and boop. So all the Jews are supposed to die. And Mordecai says, well, Esther, because Esther's now in the court, she's the queen. And I'm not going to go through the whole process because we went through that before. And she petitions and basically stops the whole thing. Mordecai becomes second in command. And the edict is finally, the effects of the edict are nullified. And that's kind of where we stopped. Haman and his family were killed. And the enemies of the Jews, numbering about 75,000, were also killed throughout the empire. Okay, an empire of estimated 50 million people. So it wasn't a bloodletting, but at the same time, it wasn't anything just to go, 75,000 is no big deal. It's a big deal. Okay? Much less than the number of Jews who would have been killed. So, and so this time period from when the edict goes out specifying an unnamed people are going to all be killed on a particular day in the future, and the Jews know who it is because it's pretty clear, and I think even though the Jews were never specifically mentioned. So that allowed time for basically anybody who wanted to really do the Jews in, they expose themselves and they're no longer in the kingdom. Okay? So we now find ourselves chapter 9, verse 20 of the Hebrew text. Okay? So let's turn there. Okay? And let's read verses 20 through 23. And Mordecai recorded these things and sent letters to all the Jews who were in all the provinces of King Xerxes, both near and far, obliging them to keep the 14th day of the month Adar and also the 15th day of the same, year by year, as the days on which the Jews get relief from their enemies. So he's instituting kind of a day of remembrance. These 2 days are the days of what? When the Jews got relief. So instead of something bad happening, they got the opposite. Okay? As days on which the Jews got relief from their enemies, as the month that had been turned for them from sorrow into gladness and from mourning into a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and gladness, days for sending gifts of food to one another and gifts to the poor. So the way the ESV is using the term holiday, it's as we use it in everyday speech, even though the origins of holiday is really holy day. So just holy day, traditionally holy days have become holidays in the Western calendar. Okay, so who instituted this holiday for the Jews? Mordecai. Now think about, in your readings and studies of the Old Testament, is this kind of odd? I mean, where did all the other feasts that the Jews celebrated in the Old Covenant, why did they celebrate them? Who instituted them? God did, right? So this is a human instituted feast, okay, which is, okay, not the only one. We'll get to one a little later, or maybe very soon, okay? So that's how it's different. But there's also another human instituted feast in the Jewish calendar, even to this day. Now, the original reason for this celebration no longer exists, so it's kind of morphed into something different. And it's even kind of become the Jewish equivalent of Christmas. What is that? Hanukkah, right. Yeah, so Hanukkah originally was really remembering the restoration of the temple, throwing the Greeks out who desecrated the temple, and that was during the time of the Maccabees. And so we know Jesus celebrated that because we can read about that in John chapter 10. So Jesus is going to celebrate a human instituted feast. So right there we know, so human instituted feasts on their own are not bad because Jesus did that. Okay? But the question is, we always want to look at it to make sure that it kind of fits within the, that its focus is proper, so on and so forth. Okay? So do we remember when Mordecai kind of went out earlier in chapter 8? He's dressed all fancy like the king, and it's all huge and celebratory, etc., honoring him. Well, really, Xerxes, but right below Xerxes, him. Okay? So this passage is different, isn't it? Because it's not all about Mordecai. It's really the Jews celebrating this turn of events. Okay? Now, really celebrating God turning the events. And so the Septuagint takes this much more boldly than the Hebrew text does. Because in the Hebrew text, when you read it, you know God is behind this, and it's implied, and the implications in what's implied in the Hebrew text, the Greek states directly most times. Okay? So, and then, but also what happens, let's look at the end of verse 20, let's look at verse 23 and see some of the things that take place. So the Jews accepted what they had started to do and what Mordecai had written to them. Okay? So it's now become part of the Jewish culture. Thank you, Deb. Okay? But what took part of it in the end of verse 22? Feasting and gladness and days for sending gifts of food to one another and gifts to the poor. See, that gifts to the poor really help celebrate and help remember what? The turn of fortune, the reversal of events. So if you're poor and you get a bunch of food for feasting on a particular day, for that one day, you're eating like a rich person. See? So in a sense, by doing this allows everybody to kind of celebrate, even if you're poor. See? So, I think you would kind of need a good cohesive culture for that to work, which we don't have. But I mean, if we did, can you imagine California where homeless people get to feast or something? Well, I don't know if it... I don't know. I can't even go there because the number of homeless is, there's so many and it's so dysfunctional. But yeah, that everybody in a sense gets to participate in this thing because everyone is of this culture and of this thinking. So in that sense, these are things that help keep people together. I mean, if you just look at it from take out the religious aspect, it's good culturally, okay? Of course, it's also wondrous religiously too, because why? We're reminded of what God did and how he worked. And we'll get into that in a moment, okay? So let's look at the next few verses, and here we'll just take a look at a particular word. Can't really do this in English too well because the closest equivalent, I think, would be this. Okay, so this is the singular, this is the plural. Okay, this is the singular, and this is the plural. Normally, if in English, the general rule is if something's plural, you add an s. But then die would become dies, and that would be really confusing because, that's a verb of somebody passing away. Okay, so when they mention Purim, it's the plural. Okay, and that's because it involves the equivalent of using dice. Okay? Okay. So verses 24 through 28. For Haman the Agagite, now remember, what did Mordecai say he was? If you remember from the Greek text, the edict that went out? Yeah, he was Macedonian. So, it's like, let's just make something up. He's the arch enemy, right? So this would be after 9/11 if the president makes a decree or something and says so-and-so is a jihadist or something, and you're like, how can he be a jihadist? He's a Roman Catholic from Northern Ireland, whatever. But okay. For Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them and had cast pur, that is, lots. Okay, so it should say lot, but we won't quibble. Okay, to crush and destroy them. But when it came before the king, he gave orders in writing that his evil plan that he had devised against the Jews should return on his own head, and that he and his son should be hanged on the gallows. So this is really Mordecai just recounting what happened. Okay? Therefore they call these days Purim, after the term pur. Okay? Therefore, because all that was written in this letter and what they had faced in this matter, and of what had happened to them, the Jews firmly obligated themselves and their offspring and all who joined them, that without fail they would keep these 2 days according to what was written, and the time appointed every year, that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation. Wow, that's pretty strong coming from a human. I could see God saying that, right? Okay. But Mordecai? So Mordecai's either full of himself, or he thinks this is all God's doing working through him, or maybe both. Okay? Yeah. Should be remembered and kept throughout every generation in every clan, province, and city, and that these days of Purim should never fall into disuse among the Jews, nor should the commemoration of these days cease among their descendants. So this celebration that's commanded to take place, which does and still does to this day in Judaism, is named after basically the instrument Haman used to decide the day on which the Jews died. And I guess it was fortunate in a way that it was a good ways away, because it allowed time for things to develop where things could be turned around. Okay? And then, at the bottom of this, I wrote, Haman counseled the king not to let the matter of the Jews rest. In other words, he should not tolerate them, but should exterminate them. Now the Jews celebrate their rest, their respite from that outcome. Okay? So, not bad. So, what ends up really happening is not only does the bad not happen, but the good happens. If you can say it's good. It's a reversal. That the enemies are no longer there to threaten them, and they have something to celebrate. Okay? So, let's press on. Are we good so far? 29 to 32. Then Queen Esther, I have to turn the page here, daughter of Abihail, and Mordecai the Jew, and Mordecai the Jew, gave full written authority confirming this second letter about Purim. So before, this was kind of Mordecai saying, now who's involved? Mordecai and? So what does Esther now being on this, does it do anything? Well, it adds what? More cred to it, if you want to use that term. Because oomph. Because none of this would have happened if Esther hadn't interceded. Okay? So, this kind of helps all the more. Because, Esther is now, her name's on this too. So Esther and Mordecai the Jew gave full written authority confirming this second letter about Purim. Letters were sent to all the Jews to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Xerxes in words of peace and truth. That these days of Purim should be observed at their appointed seasons, as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther obligated them, as they had obligated themselves and their offspring, with regard to their fasts and lamenting. It's still odd that God is still not mentioned once. So if you're a good Jew, you're going to see God behind Mordecai and Esther. But that still, if you were an atheist reading this, would you necessarily get that? So this is an insider's book, isn't it? Well, I mean, most of Scripture is. But this is an insider's book where you're not going to get it unless you're part of the in-group. You trust in God, you believe in Him, and you know how He works. And so when you hear this or you're reading this, you go, oh yeah, but God is all behind this. And you can say this because of all the other books that show and mention how God worked and works. So without those, this would be a godless book. Okay? So Esther only makes sense in the context of a people who know who God is, who trust in Him, who have the rest of Scripture to inform them and make them good readers and hearers of Esther. Okay? So this goes out, right? Because Mordecai and Queen Esther, as they had obligated themselves and their offspring with regard to their fasts and their lamenting. So it's almost, if you go back to Exodus and you recall how the Mosaic Covenant ends up becoming, like the covenant between God and His people, where, and it's that same sort of thing, but it's done with God through Moses. So here you can almost go, wait a minute. So this is done to Mordecai and Esther as if they're God. And of course, everyone knows that's not true. But so you can only read this in a non-idolatrous way if you have that proper worldview. Okay? The command of Queen Esther confirmed these practices of Purim, and it was recorded in writing. Okay, so this is a human-authorized feast, and it's really the first one in Jewish Old Covenant history, isn't it? The next one will be really the dedication of the temple, okay, during the time of the Maccabees, and that ends up morphing into Hanukkah after the temple is destroyed. And so after the temple is destroyed, that's when the whole thing about the menorah, oil didn't run out, because, we're celebrating the restoration of the temple, which is now destroyed. So you kind of have to change it if you're still going to celebrate it, because it's kind of, but the temple's now gone. So that Jewish holiday ends up changing in its character. It really is no longer a feast of rededication for the temple. Jerry? Oh, okay. So Jerry asks, the book of Esther is about God, not stated, saving his people. Why was there a controversy about Esther being in the Bible? And that's the exact same reason. The controversy was because God's name isn't mentioned. See? It is, but that's not obvious unless you're a well-formed Jewish reader and hearer. See? So yeah. I mean, we have a particular hymn which is, if you don't have a good context, it's really just la 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 la. I mean, it says all this stuff, but it doesn't really profoundly state all of it. It's expecting the context to fill in the blanks, and when it does, it's very powerful. I can't think of the name right now, but does it ring a bell when I go la 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 la? Yeah. And so, so I'll list it as one of the hymns once in a while, but I always want it to be in a strong context where it's obvious. So that way it's not just empty words. Okay? And Esther's like that. So I could kind of see why Esther could be controversial. Okay? We're going to go over a little bit of what Purim is, how it's celebrated today, because it is celebrated. Now, the days move because it's based on the Jewish calendar. See, so that's the reason why Easter moves in the Christian well, if you're not Eastern Orthodox. For everybody else, Easter moves because it's based on the Jewish calendar, Passover, etc., etc., etc. See? So in the Eastern Orthodox traditions of Christianity, they celebrate it on the actual day. They go, oh, well, this is when Christ rose, and so it's the closest Sunday to that, and it's boom. Okay? So every year. Whereas, in our calendar, it's like, well, why? Easter is really early this year. It's like in March. Oh, we have a really late Easter. See? Okay? Because the Jewish calendar moved. Okay. The Feast of Purim receives its name from the lots Haman cast to decide the time to murder the Jews in the Persian Empire. Other than the book of Esther, we find the earliest reference to Purim in 2 Maccabees. So if you read 2 Maccabees chapter 15, it'll be called Mordecai's Day. Okay. So now, these books are what? These are part of the Greek Old Testament, but not Hebrew. Okay? So you would only get that if you read 1st, 2nd Maccabees, so on and so forth. And it places the festival on the 14th of Adar. So matches that. Many ancient peoples cast lots to decide or give their god an opportunity to a solution to a problem. Do you remember Jonah? Right? God says, go to Nineveh. Oh, I don't want to go to Nineveh. I'm going to go to Tarshish instead. And then what happens? Big storm. And then, so what does the crew do? Because they're at wit's end. They've tried everything. They're throwing stuff overboard. The storm's too bad, and they find a time when they could cast lots or draw straws, and Jonah's a culprit. And they throw him overboard. Okay? Right? In the early church, how did the early church choose to replace Judas? Cast lots. I kid you not, somebody told me of a congregation in the Missouri Synod where they will, whatever the 5 candidates, whatever it is, and then they do the equivalent of casting lots. Okay, so it's not, so you experience that as well. Okay, so good, because I thought, wow, that's pretty wild, but I had only heard that. I don't think anybody would make that up. Okay? So Jews have celebrated Purim for 2,500 years, which takes place in February or March because of the Jewish calendar. Okay? Its celebration has aspects as we celebrate. There's things that seem Halloweenish and things that seem New Year's Eve-ish. Okay? On the first day of Purim, the Jews fast, remembering Esther and the Jews fasting before she went to petition Xerxes. So it starts out fasting. So before all the feasting and giving food to the poor, there's a day of seriousness, of reflection, of fasting. Okay, which is, yeah. Okay. Following the fast, the feast becomes a celebration with much merrymaking. So it's kind of like the opposite of Fat Tuesday, or like the day before Lent. In Roman Catholic areas, it's like crazy town. And Fat Tuesday is really the day when you want to use up all your fat because you're fasting during the time period of Lent. So, and I know somebody from New Orleans, and he says all the stuff on the news is that's all touristy crap. He says the real New Orleans, it's not like that at all, at least from what he told me. So I don't want to besmirch the reputation of New Orleans, at least, So following the fast, the feast becomes a celebration with much merrymaking. Children dress in costumes and paint their faces, like Halloween. People exchange gifts but concentrate on giving them to the poor. So with all this, let's not forget what happened. There was a reversal of fortune. Okay. They send food to friends and even host extravagant banquets. Some do. Okay. The Hebrew version of Esther, also called the Megillah, is read aloud with the hearers also participating. For example, when Haman's name sounds forth, the people jeer. Haman, boo! Right? Mordecai's name brings a chorus of cheers. Mordecai, yay! Okay. Everyone then joins in to read Esther 2:5, and Susa the capital was a Jewish man from the tribe of Benjamin. I'm kind of sad a little bit because Esther really should get the credit. Soon Esther 6:1 arrives when everyone joins in again. That night sleep escaped the king, so he ordered the book of the Chronicles, of the record of his reign, to be brought in and read to him. The people also join in reading Esther 5, verses 15 and 16. Mordecai left the king's presence in royal robes of blue and white, wearing a large crown of gold and a purple robe of fine linen. The city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. For the Jews there was light and joy, gladness and honor. So this is really, if you don't have a strong view of vocation, that God worked through Esther and Mordecai. And here, Purim really celebrates God working through Mordecai. This, I'm not going to say he becomes idolatrous, but it's, there's a difference between honoring. It would be like a saint day becoming all about the saint and not who made the person a saint, right? We celebrate saint days in the Lutheran Church, but it's always about God who made the person a saint, and also what? Is there something about his or her life that we could learn, could help us in our walk of faith? If it's just about the person, if it was just about the person, we wouldn't be celebrating any saint days, not as long as I'm pastor. But it hasn't and doesn't turn into that. Okay? When the reader gets to the part describing the death of Haman's 10 sons, each name is read in one breath. So they read the names, but somebody inhales and reads all the names in succession in one breath. Why? Well, highlighting how they died together in one breath. Near the end, everyone joins one more time to read the final verse of the Hebrew version of Esther. Mordecai the Jew was second only to King Xerxes, powerful among the Jews and admired by his many kinsmen. He sought the good of his countrymen and spoke out for the welfare of all his people. So, a bit of a slight hagiography. But on the main, I would say that's true, right? So, when you think about some of our political leaders throughout our nation's history, some presidents, later on you go, wow, there were some despicable things about this person or that person. But we don't honor the person or remember the person about those sorts of things, right? So when we think of Martin Luther King Jr., he slept around on his wife. But, okay, what else? But he was a great champion for civil rights. See, so Mordecai, he had his flaws, and we're going to get into those. Okay? But at the same time, you can celebrate what God did. Okay? I mean, every person, if you think about, oh, well, let's celebrate what God did through King David. Oh, yeah, great. But King David was also flawed. And so read through the disciples, the short little bios that we know in the New Testament. Wow. You would go, what a bunch of losers. And yet they were faithful. And yet God worked through them. And yet we too would say, there but by the grace of God go I. And so when we look through Scripture and we see their flawed characters, it gives us hope. Okay? Because read through the heroes of faith in chapter 11, wow! And then go back to the Old Testament, there's not a whole lot of wow. There's a whole lot of oh my, right? But they're heroes of the faith because of what God did. And that's the point. Okay? Let's continue with the Septuagint. Okay, there's a little bit there. So Mordecai, the edition's going to have Mordecai kind of pondering on his dream, because he did have a dream, and then he goes, well, it wasn't just a crazy dream. It was actually, God working through my crazy brain to let me know what was going to happen. Okay? And Mordecai said, these things were from my God. See, the Septuagint is not shy, okay, about adding God's name and putting him into the text. For I recall the dream I had concerning these things, and not one detail has failed. Okay, so if we remember, Mordecai had a dream earlier, and now he's saying, yeah, it did come to pass. And so for him, this lets him know that God indeed worked through him and Esther. Okay? It wasn't just coincidence. Okay? And God worked through him and Esther even though he did some despicable things. Okay? So let's continue on. This is Mordecai kind of thinking through and remembering and putting the pieces together. There was a small spring that became a river. There was a light in the sun and much water. Esther is the river, whom the king married and made queen. The two serpents are Haman and me. The nations are the Gentiles gathered together to destroy the name of the Jews. And my nation which cried out to God and was delivered is Israel. Indeed, the Lord saved his people. The Lord rescued us all from these evils. Okay. So, I'm saying the Greek text should be part of the text of Esther. Okay? So I'm going to become a first century Jew who read the Septuagint as their Old Testament. I would say this belongs in the text. Okay? God has worked such signs and wonders as have never happened among the nations. A little hyperbole, but the point is made. God did this. What is he saying about himself? Oh, he's in there, but who did it? God. Yeah. Okay. Light and sun. Since the text does not explain the significance of light and sun, we should understand them as Esther earlier used light as a symbol of well-being. And we could just, in general, light and sun, those are good things. Especially within the, overall framework of Scripture, unless you're in the desert and dying of thirst, right? Okay. So how was God at work through Esther and Mordecai despite their sin? He worked through them. He worked through events. He even worked through their sin. See, this is the wonder of God. He can work through sin even though he did not cause the sin or will the sin. And so we can see this in Jesus' crucifixion. Everybody does his or own thing, trying to save his own skin, serve his political ends, increase his own power. Jesus dies, and the world is saved. And yet, God caused none of it. Okay? So we need to believe God can work through things. Okay? We see that here. Okay. How does this affirm the doctrine of vocation? What's the doctrine of vocation? That God works through even Jim, even Sarah, even a geezer like me. God works through people. When you recognize that, then the things that God has given you to do, they're not just mundane, boring tasks. They become noble. Because why? You're doing them for a purpose. I'm just a garbage man. Pfft. What happens if the garbage man no longer collects garbage? Won't be good. Right? Yeah. So, okay. Let's continue on. Because of this, okay, now this is back to Mordecai's kind of reminiscing and thinking of his dream. Because of this, he made 2 lots, one for the people of God and one for the Gentiles. So now he's getting kind of metaphorical. Haman used lots. He's saying God used lots, okay, or Purim, okay, but one for God's people and one for the Gentiles, or the nations. These 2 lots came in the hour, time, and day laid down by God, involving all the nations. In this way, God remembered his people and vindicated his inheritance, or heritage. Okay? And they shall observe these days, that is, the Hebrew people, the 14th and 15th of the month of Adar. They shall gather together with joy and gladness before God throughout all generations, forever among his people Israel. So he's saying what? So in a sense, what? God used. So he's saying God used Haman's use of lots to preserve his people. God didn't want Haman to kill his people. Right? So think about where Mordecai runs with this. Right? Where he's saying God took a bad, sinful, horrible event and worked his will. Okay? Yes. Mm-hmm. Yep. So Betty is saying that Purim is still a well-celebrated festival among the Jews, and it is. Let's continue on with the Colophon, which is just a little blurb on the lineage of the text, which is really the Septuagint here. So, in the 4th year of the reign of Ptolemy of Cleopatra, Dositheus. Now, this is going to be challenging because the royalty in Egypt they weren't really creative with their names. So there are several times when you had the Ptolemies reigning with Cleopatra and Dositheus. So 3 times, okay? And so, anyway, who was affirmed he was a priest and a Levite, and Ptolemy his son brought in the letter concerning Purim. They maintained it as being authentic, and Lysimachus the son of Ptolemy, who was in Jerusalem, translated it. So it's saying, okay, this is where we got the information, and this is who translated it. Kind of interesting, right? So if translated, what was it originally written in? So was it, is it still, was it still in Persian and translated, or was it in some other language? Because it was translated in basically the primary languages of the empire. Went out through their Pony Express, but it doesn't tell us that. Okay. What I want to do is I want to go back and look at the rhetorical structure of Esther. I just touched on this for about 3 microseconds in lesson 1. So if you don't remember it, that's okay. But the entire book is a chiasm. I know. So chiasm is, well, that's pastor's favorite rhetorical thing. He likes to bring it out whenever it's used. And so it's a statement of basically things that are stated. It could be direct or it could just be themes. And then it happens in reverse order. But you can see this. A, the greatness of Xerxes. A prime, the greatness of Xerxes and Mordecai. B, 2 banquets of the Persians. Remember that? 2 feasts of the Jews. C, Esther identifies as a Gentile. C prime, Gentiles identify as Jews. Remember when that was mentioned? D, Haman is elevated. D prime, Mordecai is elevated. E, edict against the Jews. E prime, edict for the Jews. F, conversation between Mordecai and Esther. F prime, conversation between Xerxes and Esther. G, Esther's banquet. G prime, Esther's banquet. Of course, Mordecai's in the middle. Mordecai is honored. Well, okay. And Purim kind of celebrates that, doesn't it? But, it makes me a little uncomfortable. And I'll get into you why. But then I think, and so here when I put all the pieces together, I'm putting it together in a way that makes sense. And I can't say that this is what the text absolutely teaches. So here I'm putting it together, and I want you to know that this is my pastoral opinion. Okay? The other stuff that I teach, I'll go blah, 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 and I'm bringing something out. This is me putting the pieces together, and I could be wrong. I don't think I am, because I would not deliberately teach anything bad to you guys. Okay? And I think it makes sense. But let's go through this. Okay? So that's the lesson. Rhetorically, the focus is Mordecai being honored. And I'm going to say he doesn't deserve being honored. And we know, we'll get into it, but there were a few breadcrumbs that were stated that lets us know. But even early on, if we think through it, God worked through stuff, bad stuff. Let's look at the first bullet, bottom of page 5. Mordecai told Esther, commanded Esther to go to the palace after King Xerxes deposed Queen Vashti instead of shielding her. He could have got in huge trouble. He worked like in the lower echelons of the king. It would not be a good career move to do that. Okay? He understood Esther would be sent into a harem and become a sex slave. Although very well treated, right? And it worked out really well. But when Mordecai sends Esther to the palace, all he knows is that she's going to become part of the emperor's concubines. And so when you think about it, you go, what? That's not a good thing. So she's going to go there and she might be there the rest of her life. Or who knows what. That's not good. God worked through it. Okay? Look at this, the second bullet on page 6. Mordecai worked for the king, which meant he bowed down to other representatives of the king. So if you show honor to those who work for the king, you're honoring the king. What did he do for Haman? Oh, here's Haman. Maybe he bowed down this way. Never mind. He showed him disrespect. Okay. And he didn't have to do that. He could say, look, I don't like this guy. The Agagites have had it out for us for ages. Well, what am I going to do? Am I going to be mean toward them and just keep fueling this fire of animosity between the two people groups? He does that. And so, Haman had no love. In fact, he had hatred for the Jews. So all it took was Mordecai's little action to go, I'll show you. And he does. Mordecai didn't have to set off this giant blaze, but he chose to, because I'm going to honor everybody who works for the king. I'm going to give them their proper respect in Jew. I'm going to bow to them. This wasn't an act of worship. This was an act of respect. Okay? Except for Haman. Ooh, I'm going to let him know that I don't care who he is. He's never going to get my respect. Okay. Later communicating with Esther, this is bullet tree. Later communicating with Esther, Mordecai sent a veiled threat to her, telling her even she would not survive the purge of the Jews, pushing her to speak to the king to save their people. Of course, Esther did, but what did she do to speak to the king? You're only supposed to speak to the king if authorized ahead of time, because you never know if somebody's going to try to assassinate you. I mean, this is a different era when you always have people trying to kill the king. So, if she approaches and he doesn't lift up his scepter to say, cool, she's a goner. She knows this. Okay? And yet, Mordecai says, well, you need to do this for your people and me. Okay? And the last bullet, Esther's introduction to Mordecai to the king causes him to become the king's new advisor. Yay! Except what? After 2 months, the edict to kill the Jews was still in place. Esther had to go to the king again without approval, risking her life. Now, how do we know that? Because it doesn't actually say that. In chapter 7, when she did have to do this, it says this particular phrase. And in chapter 8, when she does it again, it says that exact phrase and then adds 2 other statements. So by repeating that exactly, it lets us know, oh my goodness, she has to go to the king again without permission. And Mordecai's the second in command. What? He's related to her. And now that he's the second to the top dude, he's getting power hungry like Haman, hoarding it to himself. That's what the text tells us in its own quiet way. Okay? And then what happens when Esther petitions the king, and it's because of her doing that the effects of the edict will be nullified. I think Mordecai eventually would have done something, right? But it was getting pretty close, and Esther again risked her life. She was in a better position this second time. And I think she pretty much knew that it was going to be fine, but still, the fact she had to do that, right? So Xerxes, what does he tell? He says you, and he uses the plural. So we're not going to catch that in English, but it's a plural in the Hebrew. Y'all write the edict. But who ends up writing it? No, only Mordecai. So only Mordecai writes the edict, and he leaves Esther out of it. So we see these things and go, oh my goodness. Wow, Mordecai, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Well, he's not absolutely corrupted because he doesn't have absolute power. Okay? And there's no way that he was as bad as Haman, but still, you can see this, right? And if there's not a turnaround, wow, see? So, sometimes don't we feel this way? It's like, oh, yay, we're sending somebody new to Congress, and he's going to clean up the mess. And what do we find out 2 election cycles later? He goes there, and he wants to clean up the mess. He gets beat up, and then he just becomes a clone and votes whatever the party whip says, right? And so here's Mordecai, yeah, it didn't take him long, right? So what's the whole point of this? Mordecai is a flawed character. But what does God achieve through this flawed character? He saves his people. See? So what's the point? Grace, God's grace. Mordecai didn't deserve what God did for him or through him, which is the point. God saved Mordecai and the Jewish people even though he didn't deserve it. Okay? So like Mordecai, we don't deserve God's grace, which is the point. Okay? Still, God showers us with mercy and grace, though we are unworthy. Like Mordecai, we can never become good enough to deserve it. The book of Esther not only testifies to our character, that we're flawed humans, right? We never outgrow God's grace. We never outgrow our need to confess our sins, because no matter what, in some ways, we're always self-serving. It's just a matter of how much and where. Okay? But what? So Esther testifies to our character, but also the nature of God, who is merciful and gracious. Okay? Let's go. I just want to take you back to the Ten Commandments, and we'll stop there. So God gives his people the 10 words. Okay? But what's the context? For God shows mercy to what? So God punishes, and it doesn't say generations, it just says God punishes 3 or 4, but he shows mercy to thousands. Could be generations. But the point of the text is that shows us God's nature. He is at heart a merciful and gracious God, and he only takes us to the woodshed if he has to. Okay? And if he wasn't a good and gracious God, none of this would have happened in Esther. Because, Mordecai, you're sending your own niece to violate my commandments? And willingly? Right? And yet, God blesses that and uses it for his divine purposes. Okay? So, the point is that we have to bank on the grace of God. Not use it as an excuse to sin, but we have to bank on it. Because if we don't, we're all in trouble. Okay? That's the book of Esther. I connected the dots in that way. Okay? Let's pray, shall we? Our Father, wow. It's amazing what you achieved through your saints in the Old Testament. Mordecai, though we can see he clearly turned out to be a loser, and yet you saved your people through him. And Esther, who really deserves, if any human deserves credit in the book, it is her. And yet, by the end, she's just fading into the background, not receiving really the credit that is due her, at least in human terms. And yet, through both, you worked your will. Let us understand how you work your will in our lives, through others, through us. And may we see the tasks that you give us as noble and virtuous and not a waste, because through them, you work your will in this world, and that is also how we serve our neighbor. In our Savior's name we pray. Amen.